event shows us that it's I mean, working as it has worked before, and it's always better to see each one in person, but we need some time still to cope with this crisis, and then hopefully we'll be back in person and have discussions. So I'm very happy, very glad to have you, and this book event, which is for us extremely important, because in our work on paradigm shifts and the understanding of new economic thinking and new economic paradigm, narratives play a huge role, and that's why we think it's hugely important to go into what you have been done and the research you did, and we have been in contact in between and on some projects equally. So happy to have you. I will immediately pass to Jörg Rocholl, who is cooperating with us with this event. We wanted to do that in common in March at the ESMT, at this huge and beautiful building. So now we're not in that building, but still cooperating with Jörg, and Jörg will say some words to introduce this session and you. So please, Jörg.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. In fact, I am in the building, but you know, the all the rules of distancing and so on obviously now make us be apart. So thank you very much, Professor Shiller, for joining us here today. It's great that we can finally host the meeting. I think for ESMT, this is always great to have Nobel laureates and in particular thought leaders in many different ways here to have with us. I think there's no real necessity to introduce you, but maybe I should say nonetheless that I first came across your work as a PhD student at Columbia with your work on empirical asset pricing, then path breaking in itself. But then also the number of other aspects are too numerous to just describe. However, say when we think of the Case-Shiller index, the term of the irrational exuberance, the neuroeconomics revolution that you mentioned, just shows, along with narrative economics, the breadth, the depths and also the path-breaking insights your research has not only brought to academia, but far beyond. So therefore, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today with us. We look very much forward to hearing from you, and a warm welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, es ist ein Vergnügen, mit Ihnen zu sprechen. Ich werde auf Englisch weitergehen. Ich habe Deutsch auf der Universität gelernt. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I want to talk about a topic of very mutual interest. I call it narrative economics, but I suppose it has other names as well. I'm focusing on an aspect of culture, is its transmission through narratives, and it's unique to the human species. Other species don't have languages. It's been proposed that we should change the name of our species to Homo narrativus, because that's what we all do. It doesn't matter what culture, they all have language, they all tell stories. And if you look at a video of very primitive people with a very primitive culture and see their conversation translated, it looks perfectly familiar. I mean, they're gossiping about other people and talking, making fun of them and laughing for some, that sort of thing. So it's in our species. And that's how ideas are spread through the whole population. So if we're going to understand economic fluctuations or the differences across regions in economic success, we have to understand how these narratives differ through time and across space. And I like to take, there's a lesson from epidemiology here, that the success of a virus or a microbe depends on its contagiousness. And the same is true for idea viruses. I guess I can show my slides. Can you I don't have, do I have an ability to show my slides?
There should be a green button which says share screen. Can you see that?
Oh yes, I do see it. Okay, now I've got to, I've got to bring it up here. I have, I'm only going to talk for about 20 minutes, but I have a number of slides that I want to, here it is. There, do you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is except it's not advancing. There, yeah. Okay, so my new book in English is called Narrative Economics. It came out a year ago in English. More recently, it's now out in German. And it has on the cover, on the English language cover, it shows epidemic curves. And I had that put on the cover of my book because it captures the meaning of it, that we live in a world of epidemics. Fortunately, modern medicine has protected us from most viral epidemics of diseases, but they haven't expanded to other kinds of epidemics, economic epidemics that change people's thinking. You know, we have at Yale, where I teach, we have a school of public health. But as far as I can remember, I've been here 38 years. I've never met anyone from our epidemiology department. It shows how our modern society is very compartmentalized in the kind of expertise they have. And you tend to diagnose, just like doctors diagnose illnesses that they know a lot about more often than they should. It's the same thing with economics. So we don't like narratives as economists, as a general rule. But it seems increasingly obvious that they are important. I think it's the social sciences generally have been. It doesn't seem to want to advance. There it is. This is from my book. It's figure 1 in my book. It shows counts on JSTOR, which is a digitized source of digitized scholarly articles. You can search by field for different concepts. So I searched for anthropology, economics, finance, history, political science, psychology, and sociology. The black line is for the entire history of the database, which goes back 100 years or so. You can see that that's a percent of articles that have the word narrative in it. You can see that finance is the least likely to use the word narrative. Economics is the second least. The gray lines show the percent of articles in the last 10 years. And one thing that's striking is that every social science is talking more about narratives in the last 10 years. This is an important intellectual change which is affecting our culture. There's a better understanding. Now we have specialized departments in universities for marketing or journalism. Those departments feature expertise on how to go viral, how to make your written work or your product go viral. But I think that it's of more general than those departments would suggest. It's something that affects all of these disciplines. Another reason why the attention to narratives is increasing is because we have digitized databases of written words. not private conversations, but these databases have some importance in what can happen. So let me advance the slide again. This is it's kind of a depressing slide. You've seen this before, I suppose, or something like this before. This shows a disease epidemic, and I picked Germany. I'm not trying to be alarmist here. It looks similar, and actually Germany has one of the best records for COVID-19. But you can see that in the beginning of this year, when the outbreak first occurred, Germany had a rather mild case of COVID-19. And it shows a beautiful epidemic curve, like on the cover of my book. But it looked like it was gone. And now it's going into a second wave. This is why you have new strong policy measures in Germany. The red dash line is the worst case prediction if nobody does anything to stop it. But they are predicting another hump. So this is the way epidemics often tend to occur. There's a hump-shaped pattern for them, and then it repeats with a second or third wave, which is also hump-shaped. That's the inspiration. When I look at the real per capita GDP, now this is for the United States, it looks like it's been trending up for almost 100 years. And there are some unusual events, though, that make it deviate from a straight line. This is a log scale here. That deviation is most pronounced with the Great Depression here. That's 1929. You see my pointer? And the bottom in 1932. This is World War II, which has huge effect on GDP. I think both of those events were big events that were caused by changing narratives. The latest event right here, which is the coronavirus recession, it's having a big effect for a different reason. It's not, I think it's still affected by narratives that have changed, but it's not as, there's a big cause for this, namely a disease. But still, I'm wondering, economists have been pondering over these fluctuations around a trend. They're kind of small, actually, compared to the uptrend. But I think those things are related. I'm arguing that those are like little epidemics along the way, but epidemics more of ideas than of diseases. Next slide. It's kind of lagging. The next slide is stock prices. And the stock prices, the blue line is the US stock market in real terms from 1871 to the present, again on a log scale. So it seems to be growing somewhat steadily over well over 100 years. And so are corporate earnings per share, which are shown in the green line underneath. This is earnings. This is the Great Recession that we just went through. It was a very brief affair in terms of years, just a couple of years long. And here's where we are now. The real price has just gone off the charts again, growing at a much higher rate than historically. Why? And I will argue again that it's due to a complex constellation of narrative. It's not just one narrative, it's a co-appearance of a number of narratives. And then housing prices. I've gotten in the next slide, if I can get it to go. I have housing prices back to 1890. I don't have rents. This is US home prices, but I think this is typical of other countries as well. You can see that in the years for which we have rents on apartments, they're much more stable than prices of homes. So why is it that home prices are doing these ups and downs? That's an interesting question. Again, I'm going to say it's due to changing narratives. So what is, if I can get my next slide, is it coming? There are epidemiologists. Well, epidemiology is a profession that goes back over 100 years. But here's a classic model, the Kermack-McKendrick SIR model for a disease epidemic. It's a 3-equation differential equation model, which has 3 variables. The S is the fraction of the population susceptible. I is the fraction of the population infected and dangerous, contagious. And R is the fraction of the public recovered. This model is not necessarily applicable to COVID-19 without modification. But I think it is a fundamental model that says that the middle equation says that the number of infectives goes up if a susceptible S meets an infected I. So it's the growth, the contagion rate is C times S. And that has to be greater than the recovery rate, which is the parameter R times infected. So an epidemic occurs when they're catching it more than they're getting over with it. And you can get to a situation eventually where you have herd immunity, when so many people have caught it that they are no longer enough to spread the disease any further, and then it declines. The next slide shows the solution to the model in one case. The black line is the epidemic curve, or the black line shows the number of infected as a fraction of the population for a certain parameter. I pick parameters that might be appropriate to COVID-19. So if these are correct, and I'm saying this is not high-class epidemiology, but if it's correct, then eventually, and there's no intervention, 80% of the population will have caught COVID-19. And it will pass away. The disease will, 20% will be lucky and never get it. But the critical thing is these hump shapes that appear repeatedly in the data, like we saw in Germany. I could have picked any country and it would look something like that, but possibly with waves of repetition that come at different times. So the idea here in my book is that we live in a world with many narratives, just like diseases, and the diseases and narratives mutate. It's not advancing. Yeah. So from my book, I studied 9 narratives. It came back. I studied 9 narratives that I thought were important historically. Panic narratives, frugality narratives, a gold standard versus bimetallism, and now Bitcoin. 4 is labor-saving machines. 5 is automation and artificial intelligence now. That's the new form. 6 is real estate boom. 7 is stock market bubbles. 8 is boycotts, profiteers, and evil business. And 9 is wage price spiral and evil labor unions. I don't have time to call all these. But they're constantly, these are perennial narratives. They keep coming back. And we don't have necessarily they're like influenza, right? It keeps mutating and changing. So the new forms of narratives for the recent, if I try to advance my slide again, the recent episode, I've got a lot of narratives so, that they grow by contagion and they grow by interaction with each other. They have what epidemiologists call co-epidemics. So in the last 10 years since the crisis, on the left side, we see the populist, nationalist, anti-immigration narratives, which I associate with Trump. It is just amazing, if you live here in America, how much Trump dominates everything, that people can't stop talking about him. It is really contagious. And if you want to have a contagious narrative, somehow put Trump into it, okay? You got to have Trump in your narrative, or maybe some other famous person, but people are always looking to how to make their, stay back here. anyway, there's a strong economy narrative, a fake news narrative, a Great Depression narrative coming back, a trade war narrative, sustainability, about debtors failing, becoming bankrupt. Number 8 is secular stagnation. Number 9 is real estate bubble again. And number 10 is digital age. You know all these narratives because you live through these ones. But what I'm trying to do is think that these things, we have to think about the combined impact of these things on our markets and on our economy. On the right-hand side, I've got newly important narratives in 2020. Well, of course, the coronavirus dominates so much talk, and the pandemic. Donald Trump has changed his, he's a different narrative now than in the last 10 years. In the United States, the American dream, the American greatness, these are big topics. Narratives like patriotic themes, the Great Depression, quantitative easing, and trade war. So I'm just going to close with just a few quick examples. I know I'm running out of, this slide is from my book, and it shows the frequency of the use of, in the black line, of the use of the term Great Depression, referring to the 1930s and 1929 stock market crash in the 1930s. You can see that narrative in books has been growing. Well, there's the Great Depression itself. It wasn't used very much during the Great Depression. It's our legend. It's not theirs. They didn't know it was a unique event. And it's been growing for decades. And it suddenly shot up in 2009 with the great financial crisis, or they call it the Great Recession, which shows you how important the Great Depression is in their thinking. And it came down quickly enough during the rebound. But next slide. This is just this year by month. And you can see that Great Depression talk soared from a relative low in January to an enormous peak. And the stock market crash of 1929 came back into our collective memory as a new contagion on an old narrative. Again, it peaked in May. And since then, it's been dropping off. Next slide. This is also from my book. It shows the narratives labor-saving machinery and technological unemployment. But this is over the last century. It goes back to the early 1800s. People started to worry about machines replacing their jobs. And this followed an epidemic, a century-long epidemic. And it peaked with the Great Depression. At the time of the Great Depression, they invented a new name for it, technological unemployment. And it dominated much talk in the Great Depression. They thought what was happening is robots were taking over our jobs. And that was their very common interpretation of the Depression. We don't think of it that way anymore. We have a different narrative about it. Next slide. We're more aware of confidence and others' confidence. We're looking at each other. So the idea that business confidence matters goes back to the Great Depression, but it also has taken new dimensions. Now we talk about consumer confidence. It's just everybody's feeling of safety that has soared since 1800. It wasn't an issue in 1800. Next slide. I wanted to talk about sustainability and frugality narratives. This only goes back to 1990, but it shows that at the time of the Great Recession, there was a huge interest in sustainable living that then collapsed. And sustainable living encourages less expenditure on lifestyle, and it weakens the economy. If people think they have to do be well dressed and in a big house and a flashy car, that boosts the economy. Next slide. Also, there were other epidemics of other ideas. I'm thinking particularly of protecting the environment. So that's Greta Thunberg. Maybe you surely know her. She's maybe the most famous woman in the world, and she's only 17. She was 16 when this picture was taken, but she's not above publicity stunts to show her, to add to her contagion. And so she sailed across the Atlantic Ocean rather than take an airplane with help. A 16-year-old shouldn't be out on a boat alone. But this shows what's happened to her this year. These are searching for the word Greta Thunberg in news and newspapers. In January, that's before the Corona crisis, she was doing strong, but she's been declining rapidly. I think she'll be okay. She's only 17. She has a good sense for contagion, good sense for marketing herself. But it's both the rise and fall of epidemic you have to take account of. It's not just what's getting fashionable now, but what's being forgotten. So I think that we can do research in the future that will change the way we think about the economy. My book is not the last word. It's more like a research proposal. We have to be somehow systematic on how we can get data. Digitized text and speech is there. It's a vast data set. But I think that we can improve the data sets by making sure that they're representative, for example, of the population, by attaching demographics and descriptions of people who are saying things. And I think this will eventually be incorporated into economic theory. So this is what I see as a future. It's not me. Talk about narrative economics has really been going on for over 100 years. But it hasn't really become mainstream in the economic profession. This is both a research proposal and a prediction. It's a research proposal that's beyond any one person. It's too big a task. And it's a prediction that they will do this. And we'll see more attention to economics will look more like sociology or psychology. It's already happening. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this excellent presentation. I wanted to say to all the people online and following that if you want to ask a question, please use the question and answers or chat to indicate that you want to ask a question, and then we will bring you in, either written, so I will or someone will read it, or you can speak on your own. Please indicate if you want to speak on your own. Bob, I just want to ask first, now after the pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic and the experience, did you learn something from how to handle epidemics in these latest months on bringing that into the...
Well, one thing, yeah, so I wrote my book before there was any news about the coronavirus, at least not COVID-19. And I learned, one thing I learned about that seems important is the importance of co-epidemics between narratives and diseases. There's already some research in epidemiology. During the Ebola crisis, some epidemiologists interviewed or surveyed people living in Africa where Ebola was raging, and found surprisingly that a substantial fraction, maybe it was a quarter of respondents, didn't believe there was an epidemic. How could you not know about Ebola right in the midst of it? Well, they thought it was like a hoax or it was some political scheme and didn't believe it. So we're seeing that kind of thinking here. In the United States, compliance with the COVID-19 mitigation is weak. And that's because there has emerged a different narrative parallel to it. There's an anti-vaccination narrative, that there's a conspiracy in vaccinators. I associate all this with Donald Trump. I don't know if I'm being unfair to him. You know, it's geographical, like disease epidemics. And so where I live in Northeast United States, there's hardly anyone who likes Trump. And if they do like Trump, they won't say it because they'll get scowls from people. When I visit my relative in my home city of Detroit, I'm shocked at what they believe. It's like a different universe. That's how people people are, and but it is also multiple epidemic. You know, we don't study narrative epidemics. There isn't much of a literature on it, so we don't even have any sense of proportion about which epidemic is. Epidemiology is much more advanced. So economics is about like epidemiology was in 1900. We've got a long way to go to understand these narrative epidemics.
Jörg?
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side for this inspiring talk, and in particular for laying out a research, you could say, agenda for years or decades to come. I have one specific question regarding the link between narrative economics and, say, your earlier research on asset pricing. Is there any reason to believe that narrative economics has an impact on asset prices, in particular when you think of value growth tech stocks being valued the one way or the other? Also, you also say coming out of fashion or getting out of fashion.
Yeah, back then I've been writing about bubbles in financial markets, and back then I was using ratios of like the CAPE ratio, but there's much more that can be done, and I think that it's not hopeless to improve your investing by studying what's actually happening, but there hasn't been a focus on. We haven't been learned. Most of us haven't really appreciated how to think like epidemiologists, and it's about what is contagious and why, and what kind of mutation experience could you affect. So yes, things happen that are in the form of narratives that drive financial markets. But it's still in the realm of personal judgment. And there's a lot of fakery. There's a lot of people who pretend to have judgment about demand. You know, people have been interested in narratives. There used to be a regular column in the Wall Street Journal called Wall Street Gossip. Gossip is a vulgar form of narrative study. So they'd have a regular thing every day about what the gossip was. People had an intuitive sense that it has to matter, but they didn't know how to. It's like we're launching out on a study of butterflies that entomologists do, and no one has yet ever classified butterflies or had any systematic. And your first approach when launching into that is, my God, there's a lot of different kinds of butterflies. And you feel daunted by it. That's where we are in narrative economics.
Thanks, excellent. I think there are a lot of questions in the question and answers already, and I think a lot of turn around the question: how far are you in understanding the reasons why narratives start? How to explain, and then the next question would be how to proactively use them or try to produce them. Is there how is your understanding on the factors that are producing narratives?
Yeah. Well, we already have. I mentioned we have marketing departments and journalism departments at universities who have been in that business for years. So they'll tell you things. So in a journalism department, they'll tell you when you're writing a newspaper article, always start with a story about some person or some family, and that works. it brings attention in and makes the statistics seem real. You quote the statistics later. So these are people who are specialized, and in marketing, they tell you similar things about the importance of narratives. So, for example, there was a study. In fact, it was in Germany, where they had an advertisement looking for public support for environmental protection, and in one form of the ad, they had a scientist talking about the environment. In the other form of the ad, they had a story about a baker who believed in who had asthma, and he had a terrible case of asthma from air pollution. And so he launched a lifetime campaign to convince others that the environment matters. And they tabulated how much the two different marketing campaigns work. As you must know, the marketing works better if it's human interest and has a form of a story. Oh, there's marketing literature on music. Music softens people up. It's a demonstrated fact. Put nice background music, sentimental background music. It's a manipulation. But the problem is there's so many different people who've learned marketing, and they're not all manipulating for a good cause like the environment. So I think that she's also asking about reasons why do new narratives come up. I think it is a creative art, and some people feel a sense of mastery of that art. Some of us are good storytellers. They have a Nobel Prize for literature. That's a Nobel Prize for storytelling, usually. And so people in that category are trying to get famous one way or another. And their creative spirit invents things that are subtly different, that are much more contagious. It's not necessarily that you like them. So example I give, it's really not created by a marketing person, but the song, Happy Birthday to You. Do you know this song in Germany? I think you do.
Okay.
It's the most popular song in the world. And does anybody like it? Is that a song that you love? I don't think so. I think it's a song that it just has a built-in contagion mechanism, which is it became part of a ritual, and it has a regular annual event that triggers it. And so everybody knows it. So you have to be kind of scheming person who appreciates contagion. I hope that in the future we'll see well-meaning marketers and journalists. We don't always see that.
Mm. Okay, interesting. There's a question from Jennifer Harris from Hewlett Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. This is Jen Harris from the Hewlett Foundation, based in Menlo Park. Professor Shiller, so several foundations, mine included, reading the specific history of the role of philanthropy in bringing about the rise of the original neoliberals, people like Hayek and Milton Friedman and Frank Knight, have begun seeing if philanthropy could pull off a similar feat in reverse, which is to say, bring about some successor to neoliberalism that perhaps
to what? I didn't hear you. Successor to what?
To neoliberalism.
Oh, okay.
Just sort of reading about the role that the Skyfe and the Olin and Bradley foundations and other foundations played 60 years ago in supporting the original neoliberals across economics and law that gave us a narrative around neoliberalism, kind of the default of markets as the surest bet to maximizing individual liberty,
right.
The preference for individual liberty over equality, and the idea that the two were in tension, and the resulting allergy to government intervention, just to kind of be crude and shorthand about it,
right.
To sort of overly distill it. So there's an effort underway from a group of foundations to essentially pull off something very similar in ways that would give us a successor to neoliberalism, an overarching narrative, if you will, that works a little better on a whole host of solving, the various problems that need solving in the world. And just curious, it seems like your use of the term narrative is referring to changes kind of at a level somewhere downstream from the kind of coherent intellectual philosophies, political economy paradigms, if you will, that have seems like they're always with us, from mercantilism to laissez-faire liberalism to Keynesianism to neoliberalism. So I just wondered if you had given any thought to how some of your ideas about narrative that seem to be pinpointing more specific phenomenon in sort of aspects of markets relate to these larger intellectual programs that seem to be shorthand for how the lay public thinks about how the economy does and should work, the goals it should serve, and the role of government therein. That's all. Thank
you. Well, that's a big question. I'd like to know more about what you're doing, but
I'm happy to send you some stuff. I just saw your work in this, and I thought it might be good to connect.
You cite Hayek and Friedman. Both of those were smart people who had interesting things to say. There were others as well who helped promote the cause of neoliberalism. I'm thinking of Ayn Rand, who wrote the book Atlas Shrugged, or Ronald Reagan, who was an actor who became president of the United States. These were oversimplifiers, but they had maybe more impact than the people you mentioned in terms of national culture. I bet they get more name recognition today. And it's the storytelling. So Ayn Rand's story really fed into her story of Atlas Shrugged. It was a book. I haven't read it actually, but I understand it's a book about a revolt of the hardworking intellectual people, smart people who were supporting the economy by hard entrepreneurial work. And then they were so maligned and unappreciated that they went on strike. And then everything collapsed. And then people wanted them back. And that just feeds into the psyche of someone who feels neglected or unsuccessful in life. I'm like one of these people who have been held down by liberals. And so it tied it into racial and ethnic conflicts that made it very personal and led to the free market revolution that we see. So yeah, I'm wondering about how we can think of a more enlightened approach, more balanced approach. Free markets, I think I do help. We do want them. But they do lead to, well, right now we're seeing a rise in inequality around the world. And there's still a lot of neglect of important problems. So how we can, building a new narrative. Maybe you should write a novel. I think that's one thing that can be done. But it has to be focused on good contagion. You don't necessarily want the novel to be remembered. You want to have the ideas in the novel, some names or slogans for thoughts that are enlightened. That's just what I can say now. I'd like to hear more about your foundation and what you're doing.
Thanks.
So we will be able to arrange. Vinit Rishi from the Oak Foundation. Would you like to ask a question your own, or should I read it?
You can read it.
Okay, so Vinit is asking if these narratives precede events or follow them. That's a very important question, I think. So are they having a predictive power in any way?
Yeah, now economists are really onto causality, and they like to do experiments. That's why I quoted you an experiment in Germany that I was telling you about the baker who had asthma and made it a life's work to take on the industrial giants and stop them from polluting. That was a controlled experiment about whether what the effect would be of a real narrative approach to communicating. But it's hard to actually do economic experiments, and this is a problem with economics, because if you want to do something to see how it affects the whole economy, that's too big and important to, no one would allow you to do that. So there are ways to get at contagion, and you have to somehow make it a, well, one thing is to look at history for quasi-controlled experiments. Who am I quoting here, by the way? We've already mentioned him. Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman advocated looking at history for events that were random and affected one place and not another. You know, he was a smart man. I actually recommend reading him, although I don't think you should take all of his conclusions. But he also, you know, he had an understanding of the importance of, he turned University of Chicago into a free market bastion, and made it into a story about a school of thought. Most people don't even try to do that. He thinks big. He thought big. So yeah, I think causality, but I think that the answer is going to be, when you do careful study of causality, it goes both ways. So for example, COVID-19 started out as a mutation in the genome of some virus. Well, it's not alive. It's a virus, but and then it spread through the population. It was exogenous, but it formed a response to it that affects further transmission. And in the United States, there was a major response to it, that it's all a hoax, that there's a deep state that wants to impose a world government on us, and we have to resist. And a symbol of our resisting is we won't take any mitigation steps to stop this virus. And so that makes the outbreak especially bad in the United States and in other countries to some extent who have similar thinking people who resent being told to wear a face mask. But these are cultural epidemics that occur. And then they feed back into the disease epidemic because people aren't wearing masks or whatever.
Okay, thanks. I see there's one question on the categorization of different narratives that you did. And the question is if there's something arbitrary behind, or is there something more in analysis involved to find clusters of narratives, different kinds of narratives?
Yes, well, I call them constellations of narratives, but there are things appearing that the textual analysis is becoming a big field, but I can't claim to understand all of it. But I think that we are learning methodology from other departments. Economists and finance people are learning about methodologies. We have also to learn from the history department. And the history department, if I might speak for them, they're not so quantitative. There is this thing called cliometrics, which is history emphasizing statistics. But that's still, there's something else about immersing yourself in some time in history and trying to understand what was going on and what were people thinking. So there have been critics of history too. Ramsey McMullen here at Yale wrote a book called Feelings in History, arguing that historians should focus more on the emotions that people felt. And when he talks about that, he ends up telling stories or remembering stories from different, what were popular stories from different times in history that angered people or made them sad or whatever. but I think that there are many different methodologies for understanding the impact of narratives. I didn't even mention anthropology. That's another department. I think it's very interesting to study primitive cultures while they're still here, while they haven't been all absorbed. People who don't know, they've never heard of Berlin or London, and they're living out there somewhere. And listen to them and see how their stories. That's a specialty of anthropology, and it's very interesting, and it can be life-changing. E.O. Wilson even talked about studying ants to learn about people. Ants are getting kind of remote, but they do have a society, and they do things in a coordinated way, and they have some altruism for each other. It's kind of amazing what these people are learning.
Martina, there's a question. Perhaps you can make it short, but on the more general idea of narratives, paradigmatic narratives. Martina?
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you for this interesting presentation of yours and your outstanding book. I'm a PhD researcher from a cluster of excellence, which is actually called Contestations of the Liberal Script. And I was wondering, because actually what we are doing in general is looking on scripts, is looking on narratives, and whether you yourself are also analyzing and thinking of bigger narratives, which may evolve as paradigms. I think this is actually something that Jennifer Harris came up with also beforehand, with the neoliberal idea.
I haven't been, so you're talking about some sort of meta narrative or some big underlying theme that that encourages contagion. I don't know what to say. I think certain narratives become almost religions. Well, actually, religions involve narratives. That's another thing. So there's an overarching sense of connection with a saint or a genius who are larger than life. That's what I keep thinking our President Trump has achieved with a good fraction of the American population. Some of them my relatives, and they're not going to change their mind. Yeah, the words liberalism or neoliberalism or conservatism have a depth, and associated with them there are thousands of or millions of individual narratives under this. That would be a good thing to try to understand better. I'm not doing that myself, except in an amateur sort of way.
Two questions on social media and digital information. So regarding, is there any difference between old narratives and the new times or these times? Is there a different kind of spreading? What are your insights on that?
Yeah, I think the real interesting thing about social media as they're evolving, we're using one right now, is that I think narratives will be less geographical and more powerful ultimately. Yeah, I know. Are you being invited to parties where Zoom parties? I've been, and you lose your sense of space. Where are we? We're like hovering in some virtual reality, but it's real people there. So that's so you can make friends with people who are on the other side of the planet, and it just I think the social media have yet to evolve. Maybe I don't know about party social media that allows you to have a virtual party. We do it with Zoom, but it doesn't seem to be designed for that. You want to somehow mingle, I don't know, effectively at a party. And maybe they can improve on traditional parties. I'm trying to think how to make it better. But this is a fundamental change in our communications patterns, which will affect the way narratives take hold. And it will affect our sense of patriotism. I think already we're losing patriotism, at least among the cosmopolitan class. This isn't new. Robert K. Merton, the sociologist, wrote a famous study about a small town in New England that he visited and decided that there's two kinds of people in the town. There's the cosmopolitans and the locals. That struck him in interviewing with the cosmopolitans kept talking about things happening around the world, and the locals kept talking about what's happening right here in our village. But that division is breaking down. It's going to be a fundamental change. I hope it proceeds well. It's a worthy topic of study.
There's a related question on narratives and propaganda and the distance between the two, and that maybe social media may contribute to narrow the distance between using this as narrative and propaganda. You must be confronted with this question very frequently on, talking about narratives and the power of narratives, and then the danger probably also to use them as in a propaganda manner. So what's your take on
that? Well, I wasn't going to bring up Adolf Hitler, but it seems like that was a tragedy caused by the use of modern marketing. And it was Goebbels, I think, who was a marketing expert and used it to unfortunate effect. So I don't know what more to say about that. I think marketing people are not evil. They're a lot of things they've done are good. I don't teach marketing, I teach finance. But I tell them that even here in finance, we have to have a moral compass.
Maybe somewhat related, but very differently or somewhat different. You've been talking about, and there's another question on that, on Trump and that he dominates all narratives in the US. So anything that people are talking about is related to his narrative. So what was it that he did? I mean, we were talking about oversimplification as one thing that seems to be obvious, but is there something else that you would identify? And then the next question from me would be, is there a way to counter such narratives as someone who uses oversimplification and these things? And maybe to lead to the question, did Joe Biden do a good job on this?
Well, I think Donald Trump has spent a lot of time thinking about people and what makes them click from a very intuitive standpoint. He has pattern recognition formulas built into his head. He likes to go in front of big rallies, big crowds, and listen to the applause that he gets. And he keeps toying with his message. And when he gets applause, he runs with that. And if something is overstepping bounds and he feels like critics are getting effective against him, he'll drop it. So he has also created a kind of excuse. He's created kind of a public image that he's a plain-spoken man who gets a little bit far out, and his name calling is actually offensive. But the persona is that he's actually a caring person underneath, and that's what America needs: is someone who can get tough. They're sick and tired of politically correct talk. It doesn't really offend people that much. The idea is to be talked about in a disparaging way. It's only Trump doing that, It doesn't matter. If you're insulted by Trump, you think that's just par for the course. So he's got an excuse for his doing that. He has many publicity stunts. He's got many books. He teams up with other people who have a gift of writing. and asked to build a book around me. And they do it because they sense that he's moving ahead, and they would like to write a book. They're similar spirits, but not as. So he has been also developing a very slow narrative, long-lasting narrative over his lifetime. But when he was asked to appear on a TV show called The Apprentice, as a rich man giving helpful advice to young people, he said, "I want to do them all, just me. I'll do everyone." That was a good entrepreneurial sense that he had to do it a lot. And he developed a personal style that he had many attempts to develop about being a gruff man who speaks out and tells you that you're a loser if you think so, but maybe gives you some helpful advice. And he got a television audience. And so it developed his persona. So he can get away with things that the rest of us wouldn't. You notice there aren't very many people who copied his name calling. You know, he doesn't just call Joe Biden Sleepy Joe. He doesn't call him Sleepy. It's his name, according to Trump. But nobody copies him in that because that's a Trump thing. Or maybe somebody does, but Trump can get away with it because he's colorful and everyone admits that. So it's a lifetime development of his public image that he has managed himself. I think it's on his own. It seems so. And it's a risk-taking mentality that he will go out tweeting things that look like no head of state should tweet something like that. He announces policy. He announces that someone is fired before he tells the person. And it's all thought, his supporters will say, "I know he shouldn't do that, but we're tired of hearing all these politically correct people as our nation becomes swamped with immigrants." So, he knows that that's something that matters. So anything that matters, whether it's a current problem or not, he will bring it back. It's like bringing back old recurrent narratives. So he made the Mexican invasion a crisis when it really wasn't a crisis. It's been something that's been going on for decades, but somehow we have to deal with it right now. People voted for him thinking you want to see change, and he'll shake things up. He may offend people. He might even get impeached, but it'll wake people up. And this is our cry for help among each other, among an abused, forgotten man. That's the story. So his image recalls that story. And now he's got a platform that he can continue to use, whether he continues to be president or not.
There's been a question, Peter Heller. Would you ask yourself or?
Thanks, I can do. Just let me get it back. Here I am. It's a question about topics which might qualify as economic narratives. Well, the first one which I mentioned is climate change. You have partly answered that in showing us the popularity curve of Greta Thunberg and the drop now in the COVID-19 crisis. The topic number 2 is about what we call the new heroes. You were telling us that narratives are partly stories about larger than life personalities. Well, that brings to my mind social entrepreneurs, the social entrepreneur movement, driven by big philanthropy as well. Do you think that can be an empirically relevant narrative and would be worthwhile to look into?
Well, yeah, narratives often don't seem to, they often don't seem to be optimizing from the standpoint of economists. I was just thinking of, what's his name? The 8th century historian of England. telling stories about how the monasteries were flooded with people who wanted to live the rough life of a monk. And who am I thinking of? Anyway, we've had narratives that exploit that were very reducing in selfish demands, and much. Well, they tend to be religious. They tend to be saints. You have people who are remembered for their altruism, and people who aspire to be remembered that way. So the social entrepreneur is indeed a new hero. So I've documented the word entrepreneur, by the way, didn't even exist until plug my battery in. It didn't even exist until the 19th century in English. It was a French word. I don't think we had a word for entrepreneur. I looked up synonyms of it. What would they say in the 19th century? The word entrepreneur, this is, it has something to do with promoting invention. They had the word inventor, but even inventor wasn't so common in the early 19th century. So Thomas Edison was in the U.S. was the first real inventor entrepreneur, and it became a huge hero. And but social entrepreneur is a new category. I don't think that phrase goes very far back. It's a new concept. Although there were entrepreneurs who were social, like Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company was famous for paying his workers more than he had to. And so he was, you might call him a social entrepreneur. They didn't have a word for it. But I think that maybe there is something happening there. I have to investigate that further. And it might be a long wave.
Maybe just to come back to the climate question, is there any explanation on why this has collapsed? Is a pandemic just more important than climate change, or what does it tell us about the?
What does what tell us? What collapsed?
On climate or grid?
Oh, the interest. Yeah, I think that narratives crowd each other out. We've been there and done that. And we also sense a certain tension talking about climate change. We're all in it together against the pandemic. But I'm thinking, talking to my relatives in Detroit, I have to be careful not to offend them because they are, some of them are not college graduates, and they have maybe they think I'm lording it over them. I don't know. And so climate change is right now at this time of national hardship, international hardship with the COVID. It just isn't such a gem for introducing into conversation. It just isn't working.
Maybe that should be a better narrative, better wording on that.
Yeah. Well, we have politicians, they have focus groups where they try things out on people's. So, for example, George Bush in the 2004 election used the phrase ownership society. That's a new word for neoliberal or free market thinking. And he tried, why did he use that? There's a science to this because they tried it out in focus groups and a lot of people liked it. It wasn't so divisive. When you say free market liberal, that offends some people who feel that they're being exploited under the free market. Ownership society, it just sounds like there's an expression, take ownership of the problem. This is my problem. So it sounds kind of like a key word for social entrepreneurism. in a way. And they figured it out. They got it. And he nailed the election. He won. I think that phrase is fading, though.
There's one question from Thomas Pfanne, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you.
Okay, I was wondering whether analyzing narratives couldn't lead us away from observing the power or the might that is behind those narratives. And I would like to evidence this theory by comparing the two debates. One was Trump couldn't interrupt Biden at any time and just crushing him. And even though the moderator tried to restrain him, he went from the battlefield as a victor. Whereas when you have a level playing field, the reasoning is quite differently viewed. So I think when we observe which narratives are victorious or not, let's not forget how much power is behind them. And so there's, let's say, if we talk about a Russian perspective, the Russian perspective is a minority view in the world community, in the OPCW, for instance. And so this narrative is believed by some groups and others not. So let's maybe look or put more focus on the power behind them and the narrative, the trickle-down economy is, for instance, paid by billions of mindful persons. We saw it in the Davos meeting when this, I think, Netherlandish journalist said, how much money do you get for sharing those narratives? And so I think the narrative as such and arguments as such don't have any inherent power. The power comes from the people who are followers of those narratives. Even if they are paid followers, doesn't matter. If they have the power, then the narrative is a winning one. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm getting, you mean the power behind a narrative is an idea? Or is it an organization?
No, not as an idea. I mean, the narrative, I think, is an idea, nothing else. But we humans tend to listen not to what is said, but to who says it. And that has a much bigger effect on us than the mere content.
Well, yeah, it is. That is a theme I came to in my book. Certain accidents of our language tend to imbue words with deep meaning. And this is what the philosopher John Locke in the 1600s warned against. He called it taking words for things. So thinking that somehow some little story about free markets or the gold standard or something as something stable and permanent and written in the sky has excessive influence in our thinking. We tend to pick up idea that I was saying that Trump goes around giving trial balloons for narratives, and he has a sense, an intuitive sense. If I make a scandal about such and such, or I call somebody an idiot, it will be talked about, and then listens for the reaction, and is constantly playing a game that only he can play, who has thought about his special niche. So he has tremendous power he didn't have to pay money to get national attention. He just did publicity stunts. And then the news media would follow every one of those stunts. The power was not in donations. The power was in his narrative. narratives, I think, there's some core idea in a narrative that persists. So I mentioned, for example, machines replacing jobs, mechanization. That narrative has come up again and again in our history, but it has to be adopted to whatever is new right now. I don't know, maybe I'm repeating myself, but you're trying to push me to be more, it seems, more focused on fundamental forces in our society. Whereas maybe in my book, I was a little bit flippant, that I tended to think of crazy narratives as spontaneously arising and being exploited by people who are looking for them.
Maybe we can, there are 2-3 questions which open just another field, which is more on the academic side and research side. One question is, do you have a sense, which is from Nico da Silva, I read it, do you have a sense of what empirical narrative economic studies would look like? You mentioned at the end that there will be, and what the agenda might be. For example, would there be variables capturing pervasive narrative threats in economic models?
Let me first just mention that one thing that I've believed in for years and years is that we need consistent collection of data about narratives, but consistent in the sense that we have a random sample. We know that, or we know what the sample is, and we're not just reading one source. So I started in 1989. That's over 30 years ago, with a regular survey of both stock market opinions and housing market opinions. I did a column in the New York Times on Sunday describing one of my results of this 30-year project of mine. It hasn't attracted a whole lot of attention, but I asked a question, what do you think is the probability of a stock market crash like 1929 or 1987 in the next 6 months? And the pessimism revealed recently in answer to that question is remarkable. We have more people thinking that a crash is imminent than ever before since 1989. Just a little bit above what it was in 2009. People were very worried about a crash, 1929 style crash in 2009. But they're worried even more now in the United States. So I think that it's, we have data that has been collected in the form of newspapers or magazines or legal briefs or corporate reports. That's all writing for a public consumption. We don't have a lot of consistent data through time on private conversations or random samples. The other thing is incorporating narratives into economic theory. I think that has to be done. I find it difficult to know just how to do that. But if you look at Keynesian theory, which it was buoyed into top importance because of its connection to the Great Depression and various narratives, expressing ideas that weren't original with Keynes. But that kind of model is a feedback model. Keynes' general theory was built around a model that if government spends more, that will create incomes for people who will then spend the money. There will be multiple rounds of expenditure from stimulus that will be stronger than the original stimulus. So deficit spending is desirable. That is a feedback model, but I think it underestimates the feedback that supports it, because it's also a narrative feedback that the government is now doing deficit spending. So there was a quick market recovery in 2020, in late March of 2020, after our central bank, the Federal Reserve, announced extreme policy to mitigate the crisis. And I think that was another feedback that has to be considered in understanding the rebound of the economy. So yes, there's a lot to be done. I think if I hadn't written the book, it wouldn't make much difference. We would see people doing. They're already starting to think along these lines. When you look at the fake news that we have today and about people with strange beliefs among us, the idea of rational expectations defining people's ordinary market behavior just doesn't seem right.
I would take one other question from John Gore, maybe one of two questions, maybe on Brexit and.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you for the talk. I'm a student at ESMT right now, an MBA student, and I'm sorry I didn't get to see you live. I think I'll just ask one of the questions that I posted, but the question is about Brexit, and the Brexit narrative was an excellent narrative for its creators. In my opinion, it seemed to take hold through misinformation and in uncertainty. What is the relationship between uncertainty, misinformation, and a viral narrative?
Yeah. The viral narratives that they often occur in a subject area that faces fundamental uncertainty. So the term uncertainty, I think, took impetus from a famous book written by Frank Knight around 1930 called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. In that book, he defined uncertainty as something characteristic of a situation where there's no way to define probabilities. It's just unknown. And the businesses face substantial uncertainty because there's so many factors that define a success in business. John Maynard Keynes, writing in 1936, refers to Frank Knight and his uncertainty and says that we have instincts to deal with uncertainty, which are animal spirits, he says, that people want some kind of adventure. They thrive on adventure, so they do things that are inherently risky, whose probability of success is just unknown. So narratives come in to fill the place, and a storyteller who can tell an inspirational story can have more, let's make America great again, that Trump is saying. So he's coming in with a story. So I think that this story about, there is a general story that we want to go it alone. That underlies Brexit. It underlies Donald Trump's immigration policy and a lot of other things that are happening around the world. That is a strong narrative now. And it's partly, I think, I mentioned before that sometimes the fading of narratives is important. The fading of World War II memories is, I think, an important driver of what's happening now. World War II came up as such a tragedy that people were willing to take risks to solve that. So they formed the European Union amidst countries that were bitter enemies before. But the people who remember World War II personally are dying out. And it's not the same time again. So there's a possibility of bringing back old nationalistic narratives, and that's what Trump has done. It sounds like a repeat of things happening many years ago.
Yeah, very interesting. That leads, we're approaching the end of our talk, to something that I want to and need to ask or to come back to is, I mean, we're a few days ahead of the election next Tuesday. Would you think that Joe Biden has done a good job, or is there something of a, compared to what you said on Trump and his narratives, is there something either by Biden or someone else, coming up as a new narrative that may also help to win the election or be the next narrative that replaces the Trump one? Are there some words that are maybe coming up, or his stories that you've told?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I'm not thinking, you could ask Donald Trump that, and if he would be truthful, he'd have an idea, because he thinks about this all the time. So one reason why they, I think, nominated Joe Biden is there is a lot of anxiety raised by Donald Trump. He has kind of battle mode, and he's threatening other countries. And most people don't like that. So the reason they picked, my theory, the prominent reason why they picked Joe Biden is he was vice president before. He's someone that we know he was 8 years in the vice president position and nothing terrible happened. So that's enough to motivate many people to vote for him. I think he's doing a good job. I think he will probably win on Tuesday. And then the next thing, well, it won't be known on Tuesday. We'll go through a period where Trump is claiming it was fake and that he didn't really lose. But I'm hopeful that eventually new leadership will appear. Yeah, we have to have something beyond Joe Biden. We have to find a replacement for Joe Biden. We don't want Trump to come back and run again in 2024 and win. It's happened before in the US.
Okay, yeah, let's for that, and we will be very excited to follow what's going to happen next Tuesday. I just want to share one slide very quickly to show you how inspiring, and because we'd already talked about this at some point some time ago. Your work has been for us, especially the very simple but useful methodology and sources like n-grams, and we used that to check at some point some narratives and some words that have been used in books, and came up to this very striking charts which show that very simple words that have been at the center of the market liberal paradigm, like market, competition, shares, and a lot of others that we tested, apparently have had their high times and the peak in 2007, so just before the financial crisis, and then crashed. And that may be something that we realize only today, and how much this may have changed, and this crisis may have changed the understanding and this paradigmatic narrative. So that's also to just show how inspiring your work has been for us.
I'm glad to hear that.
We would very much like to continue on that, and as you said, there's a lot to do, and it's just at the beginning, this field of research, and so we would be happy to have any further insight and any progress on that in future. Maybe Jörg, you want to say a word to?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you very much. Exactly as Thomas said, I think you inspire us not only with, say, the research you've done, but also laying out the research agenda. So for many of us to follow up on and apply to very different fields. And I think there are many of the fields that one can apply to. So let me just in that sense also concur with Thomas that it would be great to have you back again. And thank you very much for your insights and also taking all these questions from so many different angles. Thank you so much.
All right. It was a pleasure for me too.
Thank you, Bob, and have a good time, and good luck next Tuesday for your country.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so for anyone who's interested, this talk has been recorded, and you will find the presentation of Robert Shiller on our website very soon, in the next couple of hours or days. So I'm happy to have had this talk, and see you soon back. Thanks a lot. Bye.
All right.